All right, good afternoon. My name is Connor Murdoch, and I'm a first-year MBA here at MIT Sloan, and I'm also the co-lead of the Modern Sports Finance panel. Today we're joined, from left to right, by Joe McNulty, who's a CPA and Managing Director of the McNulty Group, Jeff Jordan, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, George Pine, who's the founder and CEO of Bruin Sports Capital, Randy Campbell, who's the Executive Director and Head of Sports Facility Finance at Morgan Stanley, and Alex Sugarman, who's Senior Vice President of Strategy and Development with the Chicago Cubs. The panel will be moderated by Eric Chimmy, who's a Senior Editor-at-Large with CNBC. The panel will run, just like the others, for 45 minutes. We followed up by 15 minutes of Q&A, and we'll ask you to navigate to the Twitter function within the app to submit a question via tweet, and we'll select the most popular, liked, favorited, retweeted tweets, questions that Eric will then ask. With that, take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Connor. I'll start with Jeff right away. Why do you think sports is a bad investment?
Sports is a bad investment. I'd probably caveat that with...
No caveat, just your actual
sports
opinion
technology.
from a guy who's made zero investments in sports.
One investment in sports, a fine company called Fanatics.com that sells licensed apparel online. They power the NFL shop. They power the NBA store. So we're very happy with that large investment that's there. What I was talking to Eric about is I see a lot of new companies looking to develop new sports technologies. And we're technology investors at Andreessen Horowitz. And we haven't pulled the trigger on any of the new technologies. And there are a couple reasons. There's some fascinating stuff out there. And I'm a sports nut. So, I mean, it's a personal passion. The challenge usually comes in around market size. A lot of things, ideally, they say, these will help the pro teams so much. And there are only a few pro teams, and almost all the budget of pro teams go to salaries for the players. So if you're relying on the non-salary budget of pro teams, it's probably not going to be a big business. Then some say, okay, we won't do the pro teams, we'll do the broadcasters. And there are a couple decent-sized companies that sell products to broadcasters. That First Down line in football was a technology company. So, it's a pretty good company, but it's not a huge venture return. And then they kind of say, okay, if we can't sell to the leagues and we can't sell to the teams, can we sell to amateur athletics at large? And then you've got a distribution strategy. How do you do that? I mean, that's a bigger market, but how do you get it there? So we haven't found the right combination of magical technology and a go-to-market strategy that made us excited, which is why that observation is a fair one.
But then, George, your business is all about sports and media and entertainment investing. So how can you see it so differently than Jeff?
Well, I think a couple things. And he's talking about a certain segment. I think I came from IMG. Forsman Little was a private equity firm. They had an incredible return on their investment. So I think that proves itself there. And it's interesting, Silver Lake is a technology investor, and they did buy WME IMG, and obviously they saw something there that was related to technology. And you have other sophisticated investors, Providence Equity, TPG. So I think, it's a good market. I do agree, though, you do get constrained when you look at the products if it's required to a league or a team. And when I look at more technology applications, I think you have to look into things that tap into the passion of the fan and the engagement of the fan and not be limited by a team, league, or broadcaster, because that is very limiting. And so it's funny that you say that because, while I'm not a tech expert, we do have a tech fund with a lot of experts, and I'm kind of the sports guy there. And my thesis was we can't be limited to things that constrain you by governing bodies or leagues. It has to be something that taps into the passion and fan engagement that's unique to sports.
And that brings me to Alex. At the Cubs, there's obviously the Cubs as a team, but now there's all these other investments outside of it, real estate, and we look at some of the current deals that other teams have done with condos and shopping centers, all this kind of stuff. At what point does owning a team not be about owning a team? At what point are you just investing in some sort of real estate conglomerate that has a bunch of stuff, one of which is a sports team?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the team that you're talking about and the platform that you built, right? At the core, a sports team is a brand and a content producer, content creator. And so how can you sort of find ways to distribute and monetize that content? It starts a traditional sports approach to that is selling tickets and selling your broadcast rights. But over time, how can you, to George's point, how do you sort of tap into that consumer loyalty and find other ways to sort of express your brand and to try and sort of capture wallet share, if it's either sort of in your local sort of community with a real estate investment, or finding ways and distribution channels to take your content to your fans outside your community.
That brings me to our CPA in the building, Joe. Are these even good investments? Is this just like art? Is it a vanity project? I mean, is anyone making money for the most part?
Well, my job is to make it good, okay? And using tax incentives until such time the team turns around to use the tax benefits from a franchise, to give the return on the investors in the early time. I've been doing this 16 years now, and I've seen every team I've dealt with. I've seen pain. I've seen grown men cry and then doing some investments. But on the whole, I've seen people make substantial amount of money in the sports franchise business.
But you talk about tax policy, tax incentives, and I know people didn't come here to listen about taxes, but they're actually really important when it comes to doing these deals, because the difference a lot of the times in making a profit or not making a profit in an investment just comes down to what the tax treatment is. So talk about this PSL thing you've got going on, trying to figure out how to get it tax-free.
Well, what we've been dealing with is some of the people are looking at financing, financing stadiums, they're looking at PSLs and selling PSLs. PSLs, when they're sold as ordinary income to the team, and it's subject to some states, almost up to 53% of the income. So we're working on, as accountants, and it's very easy to think it's all about what the credit is. So we're looking at other possibilities of treating, such as they've done in some European soccer clubs, is bringing in the license holder as, in a master limited partnership that would invest in land or the stadium, and it would be tax-free because it'd be a contribution of capital and not revenue, and you get substantially a lot more of the money in the pocket to be able to do the financing of the stadium.
So where do you draw that line, though, between what's a fun project? Because I want to own a team. If I'm a typical billionaire and I have just some extra money to burn and I want to be cool and I want to have a team, but then I got to talk to you to worry about taxes and trying to do it right. I mean, when you talk to these guys, the billionaires that are lining up at your door waiting to buy teams, how much of it really is about just fun and how much of it is really about trying to make money?
Well, I think, one time a guy was buying a team, an investor was buying a team, and he came to me and he says, I got to go home and talk to my wife, so I got to talk to you, make it work, okay? Because there is a vanity to sports, okay? And believe me, if I become a billionaire, I'm buying a team, okay?
Which one?
I wouldn't say in this league. I have too many clients that get mad at me. But I buy every one of my clients' teams because they're great brands.
Randy, Morgan Stanley guy, you think about the world from a banker's perspective, looking at, relative to the stock market, relative to the bonds, but teams themselves, I mean, where do we go now? Because they're getting so expensive that it's hard for one person to buy the whole thing. There's not that many Steve Ballmers out there who can buy something. So if you're going to have structures where there are 10 owners, 20 owners, all these partners, does it start looking much more just like you're a partner in a stock, rather than I'm the real owner of a team and I can do something, as opposed to just a lot of passive investors? Think about Jay-Z with the Brooklyn Nets. He couldn't really do anything. He just had a small stake. He wasn't a real, true mover of the shares. So are we just moving in that direction closer to the Packers, where there's no real owner and just a lot of shareholders?
Well, I think you're going to still have a lot of real owners and real people that have got type A personalities that are going to want to run these businesses and want to win. And at the end of the day, as a couple of people have said here, sports is about winning. It's about passion. It's about drive. It's about bringing home championships. And so I think you're still going to have a lot of people that want to be able to do that for their communities or the teams that they've felt very strongly about over the years. Now, I do think, Eric, you're right that you are going to get, as these businesses become more and more expensive, you are going to get a lot more diversified shareholder bases. And so that's where I think issues that are going to matter to individuals, such as governance, how you decide to run a particular business, is going to very much matter. There are clearly a variety of teams. You look at in Boston, for example, where you would sort of say we've got a couple of teams that are owned pretty much by individuals or families, and then you've also got a couple of teams that are run by groups of individuals that have been put together, and those groups, I think, have probably managed the Celtics and have managed the Red Sox in extraordinarily successful fashions. So I think that model is, I think, going to kind of carry on over a period of time. And I think the other area where I think it'll be fascinating to see what goes on in the markets over the next, call it 2 to 4 years or 2 to 5 years, is that just in the last couple of years, you have started to see entities such as Manchester United, Madison Square Garden, MSG Networks, Liberty Media has said that they're on the verge of spinning off the Atlanta Braves and looking to put that into a tracking stock. And for the first time, we are starting to see businesses that are valued as multiples of EBITDA, which is a lot better than valuing them as multiples of revenue, unless you're a tech guy. No offense there.
What's EBITDA?
We'll go through that at some point in time, but it's a very long expression I can't explain either. I just make it up. But these businesses are being valued by EBITDA as a multiple of EBITDA, and they're being valued by institutional investors. And so, you know, we think that's going to be a pretty interesting thing to see what goes on over the next 3, 4, 5 years, because as you get businesses that have got very strong operations, they may own real estate, they may own a variety of other things, you might find institutional investors increasingly having an interest to take a stake in those businesses and to follow those businesses, and we think that could be a real great growth vector in the sports space going forward.
I'll put this to George. How do you value a sports team? I know that's not the area that you guys are doing, is buying teams, but most of the money is media money, right? Most of the money is people like ESPN giving billions of dollars to leagues that then go down to teams like the Cubs, but then teams like the Cubs own a bunch of real estate. So what is it? Is it a media company? Is it a real estate company? How do you
It's hard
deal
to
with
say
that?
that it's not a media company, right? When you look at the rights fees that the NBA garners or the NFL has roughly $40 billion in media rights contracted. When you're in that business, you're in the media business. So I think predominantly media rights, obviously you have the live gate, and then you have these other ancillary revenue streams, sponsorship, licensing, concessions, maybe real estate. But at the end of the day, the franchise values are heavily tied to the national and the local value of the media rights. And when you think about the world as it becomes more fragmented, things that can engage people and things that connect to people live, have real value, not less value going forward.
Joe, you're smirking over there.
Well, because I love every statement he just said, because the Internal Revenue Service is challenging that sports is a media business. And there's these credits called Section 199 credits, which are manufacturing credits. And
manufacturing credits?
Yeah, so sports teams are allowed a special deduction if they're considered a media company. And there's big litigation. I think there's some 40 cases right now with the IRS on teams on this Section 199. And the IRS at the highest level has taken the position that sports business is media, and I'm going to take this tape and play it all day long.
I mean, you subtract the value of the media rights of the NFL. What's an NFL franchise worth? Very simply, not anywhere near what they're worth with the media rights. And so that is your number one greatest asset.
That's right. I couldn't agree more with George on this point too. And if you look at actually the last 20 years, you've seen almost an exponential curve of franchise value growth, and it's very closely tied to the way media rights have grown in the industry.
Jeff's out there in California hanging around Google and Facebook and Apple and all these guys trying to destroy traditional media. And at some point when that happens, who's paying these rights fees?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. The media, the value of the media deals has exploded, partially because the only must-see live TV is sports. Everything else has gone. On the other hand, the worst of times, there are a number of trends that would make me really nervous if I was banking a future media revenue stream. One is people are cutting cords aggressively. Cable household penetration in 5 years has dropped 10 percentage points, 90 to below 80. So, people are unbundling their subscription. ESPN is losing tons of subscribers. I think it was 7 million subscribers last year they lost. TV ratings are way down. Millennials are not watching linear TV. My TV in my kids' rooms had not been turned on in 3 years. They're streaming everything, and they're streaming, and so it's the analogy to music. Instead of consuming CDs or consuming songs, instead of consuming channels, my kids are consuming shows, and they find the shows on multiple venues. Advertising is moving. Video is going online at an astonishing rate. Snapchat and Facebook are two of the largest video sites online. Advertising dollars are moving from television, where the audiences are shrinking, to Facebook and Snapchat and others, where the audiences are growing. So that's a whole lot of disruption. And let me add one more. At least in collegiate athletics, which I have a firsthand knowledge of, the football fan is aging rapidly. Young people are not, millennials are not taking to sports consumption at the same level as they did years ago. That's a set of headwinds that could create, some decent instability. The NBA's ratings for their regular season games are off by like 30% in recent years. The next time that comes up for renewal, would you pay more for it?
I mean, I would say, yes. I'll say the counter to that, which I actually don't disagree with anything Jeff's saying.
We only want disagreements. We only need one person to agree.
From a macro perspective, but I would actually say I'm personally very bullish on sports. So franchise.
But you work there. If you weren't bullish, you wouldn't work there, right?
Well, that may be true, but the reality is that at the end of the day, while the ecosystem is going to change, to George's point, like the content ownership still rests with the club, so then it just becomes incumbent on the property to figure out where in the distribution channel they have to be to maximize their ability to monetize, right? So it may not be over the linear model. There's going to be disruption, but then it's about where do we take our product, because the demand for the consumer and the fan to engage with compelling live sports is as high as it's ever been.
I agree with that too, except I'd take you to the analogy of music and newspapers. The demand for music is still as high as it's ever been. It's probably higher than it's ever been. There's more consumption of it than it's ever been. There's a whole lot less income to artists from the recorded movie stream. Artists, recorded music is a non-interesting part of their P&L now, which is why they're, live has gotten so big and all the ancillary businesses they're trying to get into so big. The digitization of that business led to a lower yield on the product. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, but it would be something that, we live in a world where things get disrupted really fast. My partner, Mark Andreessen, coined the phrase, software is eating the world. A lot of the stats I just threw at you is from a Barclays bank report that says software is eating TV, parentheses, and ESPN. So it's it's an interesting set of.
I could tease them. Who invited this guy? No one can.
I get that a lot.
But it's hard to disagree that disruption's coming, right? And so what you're saying is the channels of distribution media are changing, and there are going to be winners and losers. And I think it remains to be seen what happens. I'm not sure the music industry is, apples for apples example.
I think that's fair.
650 million people tuned into Liverpool to play. 114 million people tuned into the Super Bowl a year ago in the midst of all this terrible drama. So I don't think the comparison to music necessarily applies to sports. But as the distribution channels become more efficient and the way that sports are consumed, things are going to change. There will be disruption, and how that all turns out, I think, is a very interesting question. At the same token, you might be able to, pay $5 to watch the Red Sox instead of being part of a cable opportunity. When you put on a virtual reality set and you're able to sit at center court at Wimbledon and share that experience with all your friends, what's that going to cost? And so the thing
Why
that
would
makes
anybody pay for a virtual reality experience?
I think it'd be pretty cool if you could put a. If
That'd
you
make
could
me
put,
pretty dizzy, though.
If you could put me on the Patriots sideline to watch the Patriots game, and I could share that experience with my friends, what would I pay for that?
You could pay extra to deflate the balls.
Yeah, that's right. But
That's why they invited him.
Sorry.
So you don't know.
Am I in Boston?
It remains to be seen whether it's a net positive or a negative. And as well, these other technologies come out, right? You're also good. I love something, and I have all these new ways to share it with my friends and experience it, that is going to provide other value for people. The other thing that these other technologies are going to do is other niche sports now are going to be able to connect closer with their fan bases in a way that they couldn't otherwise. So I'll give you an example. We were looking at the America's Cup 2 years ago. Now, I used to think I'm a little old. Dennis Conner there going around in Newport, sailing. And I don't know if you see, now you have new really new, cool-looking sailboats, but also digitally, when you talk about the currents and the winds and all this other things, the experience of watching sailing through technology just got a lot more interesting, and the connection for those people that love sailing is a lot more today with the new world than it was in the old world. So I think it's unclear that how it'll outcome. I like the chances of sports. I think sports will be the most valuable piece of content out there for the future. Whether or not there's an adjustment in the ecosystem on the next few years and how that all plays out, I think is unclear. And that's what makes it exciting, and I hope that's why everybody's in the room today and at the conference, right?
All that tech, though, like if you can just do a VR headset and be on the field, why does anyone need to come to the games? TVs are getting so much better. The experience at home, all the screens you can do at home. How do you sell tickets to a Cubs game when they don't really have to show up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to truly replicate the social experience of actually an in-venue, especially when you're talking about like Wrigley Field, which is, you know, historic, unique. I mean, it's VR is going to be, I think, a really interesting to see how that shakes out. And I think it's tremendous, especially for those who can't get to the game, whether they're sort of geographically dislocated. But when it comes to actually sort of seeing a sporting event live, it's really hard to replicate that in the home. And I think, you know, for baseball, we're especially unique because we are in our case in Chicago, we're a warm weather sport in a cold weather market. So the idea of actually coming out, sitting in the bleachers, having some beers with your friends, like you can't replicate that in your living room.
But is there going to be an inequality between the teams with the big brands? So think about Cubs, Yankees, Red Sox, teams that just the whole country knows about. They can do all these real estate developments. They can apply that brand name and get people's attention, like the Dallas Cowboys did, like they're trying to do in LA. But if you're just a third-tier team, you know, just people don't care as much about you, are they just going to disappear because they're not going to be able to compete with guys like you and all your historical advantages?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, though, is when you have a league structure, the league tries to actually sort of address that issue by whether it's competitive balance measures or revenue sharing to make sure that all the clubs can actually compete because, you know, that's sort of a necessary thing for all the franchises to be successful. At the same time, there are inherent advantages of being a large market, you know, franchise asset, and that's why certain ownership groups will look to invest in those markets. So, you know, there's a little of both, I mean, is the answer.
Joe, tell me about the Devils. They're a large market team.
The New Jersey Devils?
Yeah.
Is that a large market?
In the area of New York City, right?
Well, it's a very, when it comes to sports, and what I've seen over the years, I think you're looking at it's short in distance, but real long in value.
Because you're seeing a lot of these hockey teams, they're not, with the national contract on TV not there, they struggle to keep up with what you're seeing in football, baseball, and basketball, let's say. Because you see a lot of these deals.
I've seen a lot, and I've seen people in hockey, and I've seen people in deals in hockey, and I've used the term that grown men cry, and I've seen cash flush out of some of these hockey teams like I've never seen. But it's getting better. You know, I think they're adjusting their model, you know, and I think that they're going to get better and better.
What does that mean, they're adjusting their model? From what to what?
I think it's more of a spectator sport than a broadcasting sport. I think it's less media than the other sports. And I think there's a big loyalty. This city's a big hockey team. And when the further south you go, it gets a little rougher.
And as the media channels change in the regional sports network model, and you're a third-tier team, you know, what does it mean? He's right. That's where the change. Things aren't going to stay forever. You have if you believe, I'm not taking a personal position, but if you believe that the current model and the regional sports networks is inefficient. If you're in Boston and Chicago, you probably have a high-class problem. But if you're somewhere else, it may not be such a high-class problem, and it may be more a live event. And then you also have a competitive balance where certain markets have certain advantages over others, and what does that mean long-term? And so that's, I think, another thing that you have to think about as these leagues progress, right?
I mean, there's an interesting, in Fanatics, Fanatics is online purchase of apparel. They believe something like half of all fans are geographically displaced. You're not living in where your fan is. I grew up in Philadelphia. I live in California. I'm an Eagles fan, and so it's hard to be an Eagles fan because they don't show the games. You can't find the merchandise. So I do think there's a remote, significant remote opportunity. And some of these new technologies that you're talking about, VR. I was a VR skeptic until you see some of the executions and some of the platforms that are coming in. And the experience is pretty remarkable. I mean, there are a lot of guys trying to replicate the stadium experience, specifically the stadium experience. And a couple of them, you feel like the things vibrating when the crowd's cheering, and it's pretty damn good.
Randy, working at Morgan Stanley, being on Wall Street, you've heard a lot of the rhetoric, especially during this election cycle. Similarly,
I haven't heard any of that.
Nothing?
Eric, I'm sorry about that. I may have missed that. Sorry.
New Hampshire's pretty close. Vermont's pretty close, right? Similarly, before I did the panel today, a lot of people said, you got to ask them about taxes, right? Why should...
Did people really say that?
Several people, yeah. Why should municipalities, states, the government, in whatever form, be subsidizing teams, stadiums, whatever, when they're all owned by billionaires? Right? It's a very similar theme to bankers are getting paid too much, that kind of thing. But why should...
I've never heard that either.
Exactly. So,
sorry, yeah.
What are your thoughts on that approach? Like, why should Joe Truck Driver be paying part of his taxes for anything that relates to sports?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that one, I think, Eric, that's going to change a fair amount. I think over the next 10 to 20 years, and I think that you're simply going to see less and less municipal funding that's going to take place for sports facilities. I think that's very clear. I think in the bigger markets right now that you're in, whether that's Boston, whether that's Chicago, the ability to sort of get substantial amounts of municipal funding just doesn't exist anymore. I think you guys have gotten some real estate entitlements and things of that nature, maybe a little bit of help, but that's kind of been about it.
Yeah,
I think for what you're doing.
Yeah,
in
we're
terms
fully sort of privately financed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's going to change. I think that what I think it sort of comes down to is that what importance does sports have in a particular community? And I clearly would argue that in some instances, sports it's the equivalent of the symphony, it's the equivalent of the opera. It kind of becomes the culture for the masses, if you will.
But you can't say symphony and opera, but a few minutes ago you talked about EBITDA. Like, those both can't be in the same paragraph, right?
Oh, they most certainly can be in the same paragraph, I think. I think that being able to provide that degree of culture and that degree of togetherness or collectiveness that takes place in sports these days, that matters to people. And the ability of an individual or that might own a professional sports team to be able to monetize that, the need for that association within a community, people can make their own decision whether that's important or not. But I think bottom line, I think your point's well taken. You're not going to see nearly the amounts of tax-exempt funding or municipal funding that you've seen for sports facilities in the past. I think that's close to being over or substantially eliminated or reduced.
So now we've heard media money is close to being over. Municipal spending is close to being over. So what are we left with then? If national media, regional media, and the taxpayers are all going to cut back on spending, what does somebody like you do? You talk about private financing.
Yeah.
What are you left with?
Well, I mean, so I'm not sure that sort of media money is sort of going down. Maybe sort of again some move in the sort of distribution chain, the value chain, but
it's not going to grow at the rates it has been growing.
I'll help you here. For 25 years, I've been asked about rights fees.
Yeah,
right?
it'll be
for 25
different.
years. Yeah. And every year there's a bubble, they're overvalued. I used to go in, I can remember when I was at NASCAR, I was a young guy going in and I was telling Mr. France, listen, it's going to be tough this year, we're going to have a hard time. And he goes, George, because he's been saying that for 20 years, and that was 20 years ago. And for the last 25 years, the rights have gone like this. The last 5 years, rights have gone like this. So I think it's a little premature to say that the value of sports and media is anything else but very robust. And I was looking at the ratings yesterday on the NCAA last year. Ratings were up 30%. More people watched March Madness last year than in the last 22 years. So I think it's pretty premature to say that I think the media business in sports is strong until proven otherwise. Will there be changes? Yes. But I like the industry's chances there, right? And there's an argument to be made that it's going to go up, not go down. Even in terms of as it gets more fragmented, things that bring millions of people together are going to be more valuable, not less valuable.
And Eric, I was going to say, you asked the question correctly. I mean, what's going to happen when a lot of these subsidies aren't there anymore to a degree? And I think the response is that these are now real businesses.